Well, good morning and welcome to this presentation of Muddy Creek history. Everything you always want to know about Muddy Creek and didn't even know you wanted to know about Muddy Creek. So in this year, 2022, Muddy Creek is blessed to be able to celebrate its 290th anniversary. Think about that. Founded in 1732, this church has a very rich history. Over the span of 12 generations, I counted them, its countless participants have striven to be faithful in our living witness to our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. So for the last 290 years, this congregation has been a constant presence in this location near Little Muddy Creek between Denver and Adamstown. I want to start by acknowledging a debt of gratitude to H. Martin Lausch for writing this book about 15 years ago about the history of Muddy Creek for our 275th anniversary at that time. So much of the material from this book is going to be in this presentation here. So, wonderful book. Our history of Muddy Creek begins with the coming of German immigrants to Pennsylvania. Of course, they weren't the first people in this area. That distinction belongs to people who lived in this area for 15,000 to 20,000 years. And I'm referring to the indigenous Native Americans who lived in this area, including such people as the Susquehannocks and the Conestogas, but especially right here in Cocalico Township, the Nanticokes and the Ganawese. So they were the forerunners. Back in Europe, there was a war going on from 1702 to 1713 in the Palatine region of southern Germany along the Rhine. So let's take a look at our map of Germany. So this is the Palatine region of Germany. It's in southern Germany along the Rhine here, and goes all the way down to Switzerland, and it's on the border of France, which is actually important. Because French forces had devastated this region as they invaded and tried to lay claim to it. It's happening in Europe all the time. They always go back and forth and try to get each other's territory. To top it all off, there was a horrible winter in 1708 and 1709, and a severe famine for 3 years from 1710 to 1712. So there's this ongoing war, a bad winter, and a famine. Many of the German people from this area, or Deutsch people, later in Pennsylvania to be mistranslated as Pennsylvania Dutch, but it really should be Pennsylvania Deutsch, which is the German word for German. They began to flee the Palatine region. So as refugees, they crossed the Atlantic Ocean on boats and ships, and they came to Philadelphia. This choice of destination was promoted by pamphlets that were distributed in the Palatine region, urging people to come to America, specifically to Pennsylvania, where the governor, the founder of the colony, Quaker William Penn, had opened up his colony to all those who were fleeing persecution, especially religious persecution. Included among those Germans who were fleeing to this area were people who were indeed suffering from religious persecution. They were the Anabaptist peoples, people such as the Amish and Mennonite, and many of them came right here to Lancaster County. And they were indeed suffering from this persecution because they were different in their faith than other people. From 1727 to 1775, 65,000 Germans arrived in Philadelphia, soaring in number until they made up half of the population of Pennsylvania. Half the population of Pennsylvania spoke German then. They pushed westward from Philadelphia into Chester and Berks counties, and then into Lancaster County, where they were told there was fertile farmland from the rich limestone soil. Some of these German people came to settle here in Lancaster County around Muddy Creek, which flows into the Conestoga River. The Pennsylvania Dutch called Muddy Creek Muddy Creek in their dialect, Muddy Creek. and it was near a branch of Muddy Creek, or Little Muddy Creek, on the main road between Lancaster and Reading, that German Lutherans and German Reformed together built a union church because they shared the same culture and the same language. One of the oldest Lutheran congregations in Lancaster County, Muddy Creek Lutheran Church, was founded in 1732, with the first baptism being recorded in 1730. There's also a record of a baptism from 1728, but the little girl, Maria Eve Krim, was apparently baptized at sea while traveling across the Atlantic before the family settled in Muddy Creek. She was baptized by a layperson by the name of Alexander Zartman, who then later became an elder at the Lutheran Church in Brickerville. In 1730 then, a Reformed pastor, Reverend Peter Mueller, stepped up to help perform the first Lutheran baptism at Muddy Creek, because Lutherans didn't have a pastor yet. Peter Mueller would become the very first pastor of the Reformed congregation, which made up half of the Union Church of Muddy Creek Reformed and Muddy Creek Lutheran. And Peter Mueller would soon become infamous for a reason I will talk about shortly. In 1731, Muddy Creek Reformed congregation began, and in 1732, Muddy Creek Lutheran congregation began. 1732 to 2022, 290 years this year. So cue the fireworks. The original Muddy Creek Lutheran and Reformed Church was a log church built on the site of what is now our lower parking lot. It had a dirt floor, and fires were built in a pit in the middle to keep everybody warm. And sometimes people kept watch at the doorways with firearms in case the Native Americans would attack. It turns out, ironically, that the Native Americans had much more to fear from the Europeans than vice versa. While the Lutherans at Muddy Creek were looking for a pastor, a local Lutheran pastor from Trapp, Pennsylvania, by the name of Johann Christian Schultz, baptized several children at Muddy Creek during 1732 to 1733, including his own son. Muddy Creek is tied for being the third oldest Lutheran congregation in Lancaster County. Only Holy Trinity Lutheran Church in the city of Lancaster and Emmanuel Lutheran in Brickerville, now Brickerville United Lutheran, are older, founded in 1730 and 1731 respectively. That's only 1 to 2 years before Muddy Creek. Trinity Lutheran Church in New Holland is the church that we are tied with for the third oldest, with New Holland's first baptism occurring also in 1730, just like Muddy Creek. I want you now to look at a map of Lancaster County. There's our county there. And you'll see that these four churches that I mentioned are in a ring around Ephrata. So you have Holy Trinity to the south, Muddy Creek to the north, Brickerville to the west, and New Holland over here to the east. That's significant because the founding of Muddy Creek in 1732 was not the only event that happened that year. Something happened in Ephrata, right in the middle there. In 1732, a dynamic Seventh-day Adventist by the name of Johann Conrad Beisel settled in Ephrata and began the Ephrata Cloister, a religious community. Under Beisel's leadership, the Ephrata Cloister grew quickly into a major religious force in Lancaster County, rapidly gaining converts. Among them was the first pastor of Muddy Creek's Reformed Church, Pastor Peter Mueller. And he's the one that did our first baptism, as I mentioned. Mueller converted to the Ephrata Cloister in 1735 and was rebaptized. As he left Muddy Creek Reformed Church, he took with him 10 Reformed and Lutheran families to the cloister, which rocked both Muddy Creek congregations to their core. To make his exit as dramatic as possible, Mueller staged a book burning of the Reformed Catechism, the Lutheran Catechism, and 36 other books. One of the people that helped him burn the books and leave for the cloister was Conrad Weiser, a farmer who would become a prominent soldier, judge, and diplomat in the area, and who would end up having a school district named for him in western Berks County, the Conrad Weiser School District. Enter now the first pastor of Muddy Creek Lutheran Church, the renowned pastor Johann Stober. Coming from Palatine in Germany, like the other Germans, Stober was ordained by Pastor Schultz in Trapp. Pastor Schultz, as I mentioned before, had just baptized several children at Muddy Creek Lutheran Church. Johann Stober began immediately to tirelessly work planting new Lutheran congregations and strengthening the existing ones. Pastor Stober moved to New Holland, which back then was called Earltown, in 1730. From there, Pastor Stober founded Holy Trinity Lutheran Church in Lancaster City and Trinity Lutheran Church in New Holland. He also helped support the Brickerville congregation. In 1733, the 26-year-old Johann Stober agreed to become the first pastor of Muddy Creek Lutheran Church, and he moved here. When his Reformed counterpart, Pastor Mueller, abandoned Muddy Creek Reformed Church for the cloister 2 years later, Pastor Stober then began to work actively to counter the influence of the Ephrata cloister. And he won many converts to the Lutheran faith. He vigorously defended the Lutheran teachings against the cloister's teaching, and he had this great missionary activity. In particular, Pastor Stober strengthened the ministry of these 4 fledgling Lutheran congregations that ringed the cloister: Muddy Creek, New Holland, Brickerville, and Lancaster. Through Pastor Stober's efforts, it's now the irony of history that while the Lutherans still thrive in Lancaster County, the cloister is long gone. Pastor Stober is credited in his pastoral career with planting 40 new Lutheran congregations in Lancaster, York, and Lebanon counties, and another 10 in Maryland and Virginia. Pastor Stober would serve as pastor of Muddy Creek for 13 years, from 1733 to 1746, performing over 300 baptisms. So take a look at this list of names of baptisms that are from his time, and you'll see that many of these names are actually still around in the area and in Muddy Creek. So if you look up there, you might see your family names up there. So we've got all kinds of them. We've got Fry, Weidman, Haller, Lutz, Brendel, Heft, Schupp, Frankhauser, Harding, Zerby, Lead, Harding, Kagereis, Kramer, Becker, Weinhold, Hardinger, Lausch, and other ones. So a lot of those names are very familiar, even to this day. So it comes from 1732. In 1742, the German Lutheran Church officially sent a young evangelist to work in Pennsylvania in response to Count Zinzendorf of Moravia, founding Moravian churches in Lidditz and Bethlehem. The evangelist's name was Reverend Dr. Henry Melchior Muhlenberg, and he would go on to be extremely influential in Pennsylvania and American Lutheranism. The Lutheran College in Allentown, Muhlenberg College, is named in his honor, as well as the former Muhlenberg Hospital in Bethlehem. Muhlenberg took over from Schultz as pastor of the Lutheran Church in Trapp. Working out of his church in Trapp, Henry Muhlenberg traveled extensively in Pennsylvania, Maryland, and New York State, primarily ministering to German Lutherans, but also to English and Dutch Lutherans in their languages. Wherever Muhlenberg went, he set up Lutheran churches and installed ministers. These historic congregations are commonly called Muhlenberg churches, although I think there should also be called Stober churches for Pastor Stober's congregations. Henry Muhlenberg founded the very first Lutheran synod in the Americas, the Ministerium of Pennsylvania. He also put together a uniform liturgy and a hymn book for Lutherans in Pennsylvania. That's why we have a common hymnal amongst Lutherans. 3 of Muhlenberg's sons went into the ministry. One, Henry Jr., became the pastor of Holy Trinity in Lancaster. Another, Frederick, was the pastor of Brickerville, then moved to New York City. Frederick Muhlenberg then went into politics and became the very first Speaker of the House in the U.S. Congress. Son Peter Muhlenberg famously left the ministry to become a major general in the Continental Army, fighting the Revolutionary War. And a fourth son, Henry Ernst, became the first president of Franklin and Marshall College in Lancaster. But as Henry Muhlenberg became successful and renowned amongst Lutherans in the area, the one person he came into conflict with was Pastor Stober, the pastor of Muddy Creek, and the first church planter in the area before the newcomer Muhlenberg arrived. Muhlenberg regarded Stober as untrained and self-appointed. Meanwhile, Stober viewed Muhlenberg as a young usurper, and he resented him. Their disagreements led to friction between them as two strong personalities butted heads. When Muhlenberg founded the Ministerium of Pennsylvania, he pointedly did not invite Stober to be a part of it. Conrad Weiser, who I mentioned earlier, was also Muhlenberg's father-in-law. Muhlenberg had married his daughter. And so he stepped in to reconcile these two men, Stober and Muhlenberg. Eventually, after 15 years, in 1763, Stober finally joined the ministerium. Long after having left Muddy Creek in 1746, moving to Lebanon and serving the church at Brickerville, and also churches in Lebanon and York counties. Johann Stober died in 1779, collapsing in the middle of leading a confirmation service at his church in Cleona, Lebanon County. That's dying with your boots on, right? 1744, 2 years before Pastor Stober left Muddy Creek, the church officially bought 9.5 acres, which would become the grounds for the church, the cemetery, and the grove. Muddy Creek was purchased and deeded the site from two sons of William Penn, Richard Penn and William Penn, Jr., for the sum of £1, 8 shillings, and 11 pence. Jacob Fry of the Lutheran congregation and Henry Haller of the Reformed congregation signed the deed. Even though the land was bought in 1744, the deed was not actually delivered until 1762, 18 years later. In 1748, Muddy Creek began to build a new church building out of stone to replace that log church, which I'm sure was inadequate, again on the side of our lower parking lot. It took 3 years to build that church, and it had a brick floor or a tile floor. That church building would stand for 100 years, holding services for both Lutheran and Reformed congregations, who alternated Sundays. In the middle of the building program, in 1749, Muddy Creek Lutheran's second pastor arrived, Tobias Wagner. Pastor Wagner would serve Muddy Creek for 6 years until 1755. Pastor Wagner was followed by a pastor who had an interesting history himself. His name was John Schroeder. Schroeder was an orphan who was raised in an orphanage in Bavaria, Germany. While visiting Holland, Schroeder was kidnapped by slave traders and put on a ship to Maryland. Some Lutheran men from York, Pennsylvania freed him, and Schroeder then became committed to the Lutheran Church and was eventually ordained as a pastor. Samuel Schroeder served Muddy Creek for 5 years until 1763. During Pastor Schroeder's time, the two congregations of Muddy Creek, the Lutherans and Reformed, signed an article of agreement, giving both congregations equal rights and privileges over the property and the church. The article of agreement was signed by the Lutheran elders and trustees Jacob Fry, Philip Schober, Caspar Lutz, and Valentine Schneider. From the Reformed side, the agreement was signed by elders and trustees Henry Haller, Christopher Schupp, George Heft, and Marcus Egley. The deed for the land, which had been purchased from the Penn brothers, then finally arrived officially from England the next year, in 1762. The next pastor, William Kurtz, served at Muddy Creek for 18 years. Pastor Kurtz had been Reverend Dr. Muhlenberg's secretary before becoming ordained as a pastor. Following Pastor Kurtz came Pastor Johann Schroeder for 3 years from 1781 to 1784. Pastor Schroeder lived in Mannheim and served the church in Mannheim there, but he also served Muddy Creek, New Holland, and Bergstrasse Lutheran Church in Ephrata, which was founded in 1752. He took turns and rotated around preaching in all those congregations. The Mannheim Lutheran Church requested of the ministerium in Pennsylvania that he relinquish his other 3 churches in order to come and serve Mannheim full-time. But then a delegate from Muddy Creek exhorted the ministerium to let Pastor Schroeder stay at Muddy Creek and the other 2 churches because they said they were thoroughly satisfied with him. And so the ministerium agreed with him. They also signed Pastor Henry Mueller Jr. of Holy Trinity, Lancaster, the task of visiting all 4 churches to promote peace and harmony. After Pastor Schroeder came another pastor with an interesting history. His name was Frederick Melsheimer. On June 1st, 1776, Pastor Melsheimer landed in Quebec, Canada, and he was a chaplain at that time to the German Hessian forces. The German Hessians had been hired during the Revolutionary War by the British to help fight against the Americans. A year later, in the Battle of Bennington, Frederick Melsheimer was wounded in the arm and taken prisoner by the Americans. He ended up in Bethlehem and eventually married a Moravian and had 11 children. He studied to become a Lutheran pastor, and then Melsheimer came to Lancaster County to serve Muddy Creek Lutheran Church for 4 years from 1785 to 1789. Along with Muddy Creek, Pastor Melsheimer's parish also included New Holland and Bergstrasse. Pastor Melsheimer was also a distinguished scientist and entomologist, which means the study of insects. Pastor Melsheimer has been called the father of American entomology, and he was renowned for classifying 1,363 species of beetles and publishing a book, The Melsheimer Collection of Insects. He was an intimate friend of Henry Ernst Muhlenberg, the first president of Franklin and Marshall College. When Franklin and Marshall was founded, Melsheimer was one of the college trustees and also became a professor there of Latin, Greek, and German. Quite the learned person. In 1788, Melsheimer was elected as the second president of Franklin and Marshall College, succeeding his friend Muhlenberg, and that was when Melsheimer left Muddy Creek. During the time that Melsheimer was at Muddy Creek, Bergstrasse, and New Holland, he convinced the New Holland Church to donate the land to build the first free public school in New Holland, a 2-story building that became the forerunner of the modern Eastern Lancaster County School District. So there you go, Lutheran started the school district. Melsheimer was followed for 5 years by Pastor Heinrich Mueller, who served from 1790 to 1795. In addition to the 3 churches that Melsheimer served, Pastor Mueller also added the Allegheny and Strasbourg churches, 5 in total. Mueller was followed by Pastor Peter Bentz, who lived in Mount Joy and served Mount Joy, Muddy Creek, and Mannheim for 3 years. So it kind of depended where they lived, which churches they served. Then a pastor who had once been a catechism student under Pastor Henry Muhlenberg Jr. at the church in Lancaster was called to Muddy Creek. Again, all these ties to Muhlenberg. Pastor John Plitt served Muddy Creek for 13 years, from 1799 to 1812. Plitt was highly regarded in the ministerium of Pennsylvania. At its assembly in 1805, Pastor Plitt was secretary of a committee chaired by Pastor Frederick Melsheimer, the former pastor of Muddy Creek. So 2 Muddy Creek pastors on the same committee. And this committee was charged with the task of deciding whether or not the churches in the ministerium of Pennsylvania could conduct services in languages other than German, such as English. Pastor Plitt's parish consisted of Muddy Creek, Swamp, New Holland, Bergstrasse, Allegheny, Forest, and Arcturera. 7 churches in all. And while he was on the committee, he helped decide that they should speak only German. So again, all the churches in Pennsylvania could speak only German. So he went on to serve his 7 churches at that time. And you notice that I said Muddy Creek, Swamp. So Swamp was in our parish, New Holland, Bergstrasse, and 3 others. Pastor Plitt was succeeded for 10 years by Pastor Peter Filbert, whose parish consisted of Muddy Creek, Swamp, Bergstrasse, Allegheny, and Forest. So we are really like the mother church for a lot of churches in the area, helping to found, and we'll hear even more about them. Pastor Filbert was one of the ones who voted in 1821 to have the ministerium of Pennsylvania join together with other Lutherans in North America to become the General Synod. Over time, Lutherans in the United States kept merging together until we finally get to our modern-day Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, or ELCA, of which we are a part today. The next two pastors at Muddy Creek each died soon after being called to Muddy Creek. I don't know what that says. The first was Johann Engel, who actually grew up here as a Muddy Creeker. He grew up at Muddy Creek under Pastor Plitt. But Pastor Engel died after only serving Muddy Creek for 5 months. Then came Pastor Carl Ritzie, who died after serving Muddy Creek for only 2 years. When Pastor Ritzie was sick before he died, his close friend John Reichert supplied at Muddy Creek. After Pastor Ritzie died, Pastor Reichert was persuaded to accept what was then called the New Holland Charge, consisting of New Holland, Muddy Creek, Bergstrasse, and Allegheny. Pastor Reichert, it turns out, was the grandson of Reverend Dr. Henry Melchior Muhlenberg, that evangelist who came into conflict with Muddy Creek's first pastor, Johann Stober. And now the grandson was preaching here at Muddy Creek. Pastor Reichert served Muddy Creek for 7 years before moving on to become pastor of that church in Trapp, where Muhlenberg was, and where one of the first baptizers at Muddy Creek had served. He was also at St. Michael's in Germantown, Pennsylvania, and Trinity Reading, where he ironically died in the middle of leading a funeral service. What a way to go. Pastor Reichert was succeeded by Pastor C.F. Weldon and then Pastor Charles Miller, each serving for 4 years. Pastor Miller served Muddy Creek and Brickerville, where he lived. He lived in Brickerville. In 1842, Muddy Creek sent 2 of their members to the synod meeting in Lancaster to find a new pastor after Pastor Miller left. They ended up choosing Pastor Christopher Gottlieb, who also lived in Brickerville, like Pastor Miller did. Pastor Gottlieb served for 7 years in a parish consisting of Warwick, Mannheim, Muddy Creek, Swamp, Kisselburg, and White Oak. It was called the Warwick Parish. I think it depended where the pastor lived. It was during Pastor Gottlieb's time that Muddy Creek built a new church building. In 1847, Muddy Creek's second church building, which had stood for 100 years, was torn down, the one that was right down there in the parking lot. A new church building, built of antique sandstone, was put up in what is now the site of our upper parking lot, next to the cemetery, directly across the road from our current church building. It cost $1,910 to build it. I like that price tag nowadays. And it became known as the Old Stone Church. This is a beautiful and artistic building, and it was dedicated in 1847. It featured a wraparound balcony for the men and a lower level for the women, all centered around a magnificent tall pulpit with an ascending staircase. It had 2 pot-belly stoves and an organ that had to be pumped by hand. So let's take a moment and look at some slides of the Old Stone Church that used to be right over here. Okay, so this is the Old Stone Church, and you can see it's right adjacent to the cemetery there. You see the... And I'll just keep on showing you slides here. There's another view of it. Again, the outside. Here's the inside. That's that big, tall pulpit there. And you got to go up these stairs to get there. So preach from all the way up there. You know, a little closer to heaven, I guess. I don't know. And I don't know where the potbelly stove is. And here's the balcony, and so it's said that the young men would sit up here, and the older men would sit up over here, and the young men would sit there because the younger women tend to sit down here, so they could have a line of sight on them. So, women down there, men up here. So, you can't have anything going on during the worship service, right? No holding hands or anything like that. Here's another picture of the pulpit. That's it all dressed up for, it looks like it's Harvest Home. So we have, you know how we have dressed up for Harvest Home? They have all their, that tradition has been going on for a long time. And there's the organ that had to be pumped by hand. Greg, don't you wish you had one you had pumped by hand? So there it is.
If I'm right, we know that that still exists inside a church in New York.
Yeah. It does? It went to New York? I didn't. Now you've added it to the presentation. So that organ is in a church in New York now.
You can actually hear it on a clip on the internet.
Okay.
It's been redone.
But to find out which one it is. We also have two historical paintings of that old stone church right over here. And the one on the right is a valuable historical painting by the renowned local artist Hattie Brunner. And it was donated to us by Dorothy Beam and her late husband Richard Beam. And it shows people on winter walking up to church and coming with horse-drawn sleighs. So a nice winter scene there. The old stone church building stood for 91 years. And two items from it were incorporated into our current church building. The first is the Cornerstone, which is located just outside our entry door here to your right. And it's put right into the wall. So when you come in, you can read it. It reads, Muddy Creek and Cocalico, German Reformed and Lutheran Church, 1847, the year the old stone church was built. Or, for those of you who can read the original Pennsylvania Dutch, which is it's written in, it says, Muddy Creek und Cocalico, Deutsche Reformische und Lutherische Kirche. There you go. The second item from that old stone church is our church bell, cast by T.L. Dice of Philadelphia in 1850. And there's people that are very interested in church bells that have contacted us about our particular bell. That was relocated here into our bell tower. And you can still hear that original bell rung every Sunday morning as we recite our Lord's Prayer. And that's a European tradition so that people in the neighborhood can know that you're doing the Lord's Prayer and they can join on in with it from home. The hand pump organ, which was used at Old Stone Church, was moved to the bottom level of our current church. Here's a picture of that. And it was used for many years by the Sunday school when they did their Sunday school opening and did their worship. So they're playing at the, and then from there I guess it made its way to New York State, as you said. So that's the organ from the Old Stone Church. But it's not here anymore, obviously. People walked and rode their buggies to worship at the Old Stone Church, and right across the street where we have our grove right now, there was a large extended horse shed to shelter and feed the horses during church. So you either walked or you came by horse to church and put your horse right in the shed. Pastor Gottlieb was succeeded by Thomas Yeager for 3 years, Charles Reese for 4 years, and Reuben Wagner for 2 years. During this time, the Lutheran Church in Lincoln, Ephrata was added to the Warwick Parish. In 1859, Pastor Simon Boyer came to Muddy Creek and the Warwick Parish. And at his request, an important realignment of the parish happened. In 1860, the Hinkletown Parish was formed with Boyer as its pastor. And if you drive from Ephrata to New Holland, you'll pass through Hinkletown. And that's where the parsonage was. And so the Hinkletown Parish consisted of Muddy Creek, Salem Lutheran Reamstown, founded in 1817, St. John Center East Earl, founded in 1777, Bergstrasse, and Vogensville. Lincoln was added to the parish 2 years later. In 1863, Kissel Hill in Lidditz joined the parish, and was swapped out for Swamp Lutheran in 1866. Pastor Boyer's salary was $560 a year. Our treasurer was like, okay, that sounds pretty good. Muddy Creek's share of that was $115. In 1868, Vogensville Church had a severe windstorm, and they couldn't afford the salaries anymore because they had to fix their church, so they asked to withdraw from the parish. And Reamstown and St. John Center came up a little short in their contributions. They said, we can't contribute this year, maybe next year. So Pastor Mueller submitted his resignation. In 1869, Pastor Reuben Wagner, who had been pastor of Muddy Creek and Hinkletown Parish before Pastor Boyer, returned to serve a second time at Muddy Creek, Reamstown, St. John Center, and Bergstrasse. It was at this time that the hand-pumped pipe organ was installed in the old stone church. A few years earlier, in 1860, Muddy Creek began a tradition that became famous all throughout Lancaster and Berks County, the annual Muddy Creek Church Picnic. Because Muddy Creek was located on the trolley stop, it was right beside our grove there, on the line between Lancaster and Reading, huge throngs would take the trolley to arrive for this several-day event of the Muddy Creek Church Picnic. Think of it as the modern Denver Fair and Adamstown Fair all rolled up into one. A large brass band would kick off the event, and the opening day crowd would follow the band, marching in a parade from our grove, past the cemetery, down to the Muddy Creek Picnic Fairgrounds. And that's where the present-day Peace UCC Church is, the successor to Muddy Creek Reformed Church. At the Muddy Creek Church Picnic, they would listen to community bands perform, eat chicken corn soup, and enjoy other delectable picnic foods. It grew in popularity. By 1894, 5,000 people were attending the picnic. And that's a lot of people back then. And it was listed as a major community event for 107 years, until the last picnic in 1867. And so... 1967. Sorry. Yeah. 1967. Yes, 1967. Thank you. Good, you're with me this. I like this. So here's a picture of the, by then they don't have to take the trolley anymore. They can come in their cars, so they're all packing in there. All parking their cars to come to the picnic. The horns probably go, woo, God, or something. Now back to Pastor Wagner. In 1872, a conflict arose that would rock the very foundations of Muddy Creek Church. At that time, the Reformed and Lutheran congregations had a joint Sunday school every Sunday, even though worship alternated every week between the two denominations. But every week there was this joint Sunday school. A group of 15 to 20 people from the Union Sunday School secretly decided to form one single congregation instead of having two, Muddy Creek Lutheran and Muddy Creek Reformed. Without the knowledge or consent of the pastors and other members, this group went to the court of Lancaster County and submitted an independent charter to form a union church, which was granted. Pastor Wagner resigned when he found out and was replaced in 1873 by Pastor Samuel Henry, who had no idea what he was walking into. When it came to install the new council members, Pastor Henry installed the council members of Muddy Creek Lutheran congregation, but would not install the council members selected by those who obtained the independent charter. They wanted their slate of council to be elected instead. The independent charter group then went up to the altar and tried unsuccessfully to grab the book out of Pastor Henry's hands. Manhandling the pastor, it was called. On June 28, 1874, the charter group blocked the church doors and refused to permit Pastor Henry to enter. 2 weeks later, they came to the church parsonage on a Saturday and handed Pastor Henry a notice that he should never again enter Muddy Creek Church. And if he did, he would be driven away or carried away and suffer the consequences. The next day on Sunday, they locked the church doors and refused entrance to the pastor and other members. 2 weeks later, the churches of the Hinkletown Charge met and condemned the actions of this independent group known as the Charter Party, saying that they did not recognize them and that this group was behaving in an unchristian manner. And I guess, assaulting the pastor at the altar would constitute that, or locking the doors so no one could get in. The Lancaster County Court then intervened in the dispute and ordered the charter group not to cause any more disturbances. 6 years later, however, the dispute was still raging at Muddy Creek, and in 1880, Pastor Henry reported to the annual meeting at the Hinkletown Parish that all the churches in the parish have peace and harmony, except for Muddy Creek, which he said mixes official duties with sorrow and grief ever since he arrived 7 years ago. A committee met and found that Pastor Henry had acted only honorably. But 2 years later, he decided that after 9 years of this conflict, that was enough, and he resigned. He was succeeded for 3 years by Pastor John Umbehan. During Pastor Umbehan's time, the parsonage in Hinkletown was sold, and a new parsonage was bought in Reamstown. And the name of the Hinkletown parish was then changed to the Reamstown parish. And it remained the Reamstown parish for many years. Finally, some stability came back to Muddy Creek, with 2 pastors serving Muddy Creek with long and distinguished pastorates. One for 35 years, and the next for 30 years. Gave a lot of stability. The first was Pastor Benjamin Welder, who came in 1886. In 1892, he led the congregation in purchasing land adjoining the church to increase the size of the Muddy Creek Church Cemetery. That's how we got the extension on the cemetery. In 1901, Muddy Creek built a building to house the Sunday school. It was a beautiful sandstone building which they called Grace Chapel. It also doubled as a social hall for dinners and events. The building, which still stands, is located just down Muddy Creek Church Road, adjacent to the cemetery. Paul Stober, a member here at Muddy Creek, who died last year at the age of 100, told me that his father personally hauled the sandstone in a wagon from a quarry in order to build Grace Chapel. So we had a member whose father had hauled the stone to build Grace Chapel. It was used for 116 years until it was sold by our congregation to a private individual. As I said, Pastor Welder served at Muddy Creek for a total of 35 years. I can barely imagine that. During his tenure, he also helped Muddy Creek congregation members from Adamstown form their own church, St. Paul Lutheran and Reformed, in 1911. So we also founded that church, besides founding Swamp. The next long-term pastor was Pastor Ambrose Weipensberger, who had served Muddy Creek Church for 30 years, from 1921 to 1951. His parish included Muddy Creek, Adamstown, Reamstown, Bergstrasse, St. John Center, and Bowmansville. It sounds an awful lot like our modern-day Cocalico, our group of churches, our cluster. So anyway, that was all one parish. During this time, it was evident that Muddy Creek had outgrown the old stone church, and that a new building must be built to accommodate the burgeoning congregation. The old stone church was torn down in 1938, and as the new church was being built, the congregations temporarily worshipped in Grace Chapel. To much fanfare in 1939, the present and existing congregation, existing building was built and opened. So to much fanfare, this church was open and the people streamed in. And you have to remember, this was built at the end of the Great Depression. And they built this beautiful stone church and all these beautiful stained glass windows. The building cost $59,000. That was a lot during the Depression. And it was built in a Gothic style with a native red sandstone base and a red brick superstructure trimmed with Indiana cast stone. On February 26, 1939, the current church building was dedicated. The congregants of Muddy Creek Lutheran and Reformed Church streamed in and were awestruck by the beautiful stained glass windows. In particular, the Transfiguration stained glass window, which was right above our altar. Everybody was like, wow. They could not believe how beautiful that was. And we also have, later this year, we'll do a tour of the stained glass windows so we can see them also once again. Pastor Weipensberger's distinguished career at Muddy Creek lasted for 30 years. Near the pavilion in the grove across from Muddy Creek Lutheran Church is a plaque beside a memorial tree for Reverend A.W. Weipensberger. So you can see that plaque today. Following him, Pastor Celo Leitzel served Muddy Creek for 5 years, from 1953 to 1958. You might be getting a time frame now, people sitting here. In 1958, Muddy Creek decided to call its own pastor full-time. It would no longer be in the parish together with Salem, Reamstown, and Bergstrasse, Ephrata, and St. John Center, East Earl. Pastor John Rice then came to serve here from 1959 to 1969. Pastor Rice helped to found Luther Acres Retirement Community in Lidditz, and he was the one that suggested the name of Luther Acres for it, because it was being built on farmland. So Luther Acres sounded good, and Pastor from Muddy Creek was responsible for that. During Pastor Rice's time, Muddy Creek Lutheran and Reformed congregation began to consider dissolving the union and going separate ways, since they'd each grown so large. Talks began in 1965, and in 1966, Muddy Creek United Church of Christ, formerly Muddy Creek Reformed Church, and Adamstown UCC Church joined together as one congregation, Peace UCC Church. In 1970, the Union Church formally dissolved, and the UCC congregation left this building and dedicated a new church building, Peace UCC, at the site of the Muddy Creek Picnic Fairgrounds. It was decided that the Lutherans would keep the cemetery property together. Muddy Creek would own it, but they would be jointly operated by two congregations through the Joint Cemetery Board. In 1970, Muddy Creek Lutheran Church added a wing to its building for offices and Sunday school rooms and fellowship hall. Several of the stained glass windows that used to be on that wall were then relocated to the new western wall. Also in 1970, Pastor John Kammerer came to serve Muddy Creek for a 13-year pastorate. He was followed by Pastor William Martin, who had an illustrious career at Muddy Creek from 1984 to 1999. Pastor Jeffrey Lott came for 3 years in 2000, followed by Pastor Paul Smeltz in 2005. Pastor Smeltz is the only surviving former pastor of Muddy Creek Lutheran Church, with both Pastor Martin and Pastor Lott having died in the last couple of years. Pastor Smeltz served for 6 years until 2011, and in 2014, Pastor Peter Schwabifrei, yours truly, the current pastor, and Pastor Nancy Schwabifrei began their ministry at Muddy Creek. Pastor Nancy Schwabifrei retired in 2020. So, here we are together in 2022, celebrating the 290 years of Muddy Creek Lutheran Church. What a wonderful, long, and rich history. Where will it be in 10 years, I wonder, as we celebrate 300 years, our anniversary? Well, that's more history waiting to be written. All right, thank you very much.